Alright, welcome to my second video on the Zodiac Killer design influences. With this video I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on some of the specific points that I started talking about in the last video, which is his design communications, his drawings, letters, cards, and even some of the themes that he talks about in those communications. Now, I'd also like to get a little bit more into this idea that Zodiac could be a student, given his maturity, but also lack of maturity, some of the skill sets, and some of the things that he talks about. So I'm going to have a look at part of the campus life in the late 60s, mid 60s, relating to landscape architecture. I'm also going to look through a lot of electronics and some of the elements of the bomb itself, because last time I went through mainly the sections and the drafting, but it's also worth looking at how does this all fit together? Does it actually work? Let's interrogate that. We'll also be looking at some more examples of landscape architecture documentation showing how there's an enormous wealth of information we can look at in the bus bomb diagrams and the ciphers and some of the communications that would be ideal for someone in this or another related profession. And that comes down to parts of the writing, organization, use of drafting equipment, symbols that are used in the ciphers, and a commonality, really. That's the overall approach, that whoever the Zodiac is, he has experience and a desire to utilize all of these different mediums. So it's very much this kind of multimedia concept presentation of this is the Zodiac speaking. It's been a fun journey looking at some of the electronics in this side of things, because I have worked with a lot of electrical engineers in my time, but that's mainly been producing lighting plans. And I do have a bit of background looking into guitar amplifier circuits, but I'm certainly not someone who would go and build an amp even from a kit, and I'm not really that great at soldering. But I do understand the principles, and I spent a long time searching as much as I could on old textbooks to see what I could find, because I've pretty much exhausted landscape architecture. So I thought, well, I don't know much about electrical engineering in the 60s. Let's go and have a look. And my feeling with the Zodiac, I do think he's got vocational experience in drafting and design, and the most likely profession, or the profession that would match what evidence the Zodiac Killer left us, is landscape architecture. But with the electrical or electronic circuits that he talks about and draws, they could much easily be gathered from hobbyist kits. Electronics is a lot more widespread as a hobby and in different pursuits, and people doing their home repairs or their own circuitry, than something specialized like landscape architecture. I'll also be going through a lot more drawings and how they relate to having some kind of framework similar to the cipher, that there may have been the need for a light table to base some of his design, a draft design that was underneath, and this can be seen most clearly in the first bus bomb letter. And it's sort of been an interesting journey just going through a lot of these old textbooks, because one, they're terrifically hard to find, so I've had to look through archives and different directories from North Bay, San Francisco municipalities, and where possible I've tried to use drawings and evidence from San Francisco and from the era. It's really difficult to get books older than 1950 unless I spend a lot of money buying those books online or going to specialist libraries, which is difficult where I live. And a lot of the modern stuff, it's all done on computers, at least the landscape architecture documentation. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Now, before we get started, have a bit of fun. I really love this little sketch that I found while looking through an old Time Saver standards at different drawings, just gathering examples of cars and sections and that sort of thing. But in a way, this is kind of my hope for the video, that at the moment I feel like Zodiac's hidden in the dark. He's hidden in the shadows of the case, of his own skilled planning and execution of these crimes. Who knows? And hopefully in this video, by going through more detail on these drawings, which I believe have been really overlooked by researchers and law enforcement, could shine a light on more detail around the Zodiac Killer. Perhaps might even shine a light on what professional aspirations this guy has, and maybe even a little bit into the psychology of why he chooses certain communication methods. What does he actually enjoy? That might shine a line on his identity of who is the Zodiac Killer. All right, let's get underway. All right, in the last video, I went through some of the design influences of the Zodiac Killer, particularly focusing in on the bus bomb diagrams, and particularly focusing in on this section, which appears to be copied from landscape architecture textbooks. Now, in this video, I'm going to go into more detail on the bus bomb diagrams and really focus in on a number of elements, both design and also a few things that are probably outside of my skill set, looking at some of the electronics parts of the drawings, and just really try to hone in on some of the things that I mentioned in the last video and use more overlays to try and demonstrate what's really happening here. So the first thing is these two diagrams that were sent in by the Zodiac Killer. One came in late '69 and one came through around spring in America of 1970. They were about 5 or 6 months apart, and I find this particularly interesting because he'd stopped his killings by this stage but was still communicating with police. And to do not just one drawing but two drawings is really quite amazing, because I think there's actually a lot of incriminating things in these drawings. And he's done it twice. He's sent in revision A, which is this first bomb diagram we see here, which has a little bit more evidence of formal drafting. And then he sent in basically a revision B, a refined option, in 1970. And it's quite incredible because we don't actually know if he actually really did develop a bomb or not. This was really a concept plan. It was a concept idea. Now, while these formed part of letters, we can start to see how he's laid this out. And I mentioned in the previous video that if you turn it onto its side into landscape view, you can see how the section and the plan work together. They're projected actually really accurately to scale. He's also projected the timer and the bomb diagram to scale with the section or end elevations of the watch face here. And you can see that the layout is quite organized in that sense. So while parts of the drawing almost look messy, he has had a consideration of how he lays out the diagram. I also believe that he's done this similar to the ciphers, where he's used a light table to trace over a draft that was underneath. And you can see this clearly with some of these lines that are parallel. I get the impression he's used a drawing board and a set square and T-square to get these alignments. You can see how the line work of the section matches the plan view. You can see how the watch face matches with its elevations, but you can also just see really clearly all of these parallel lines. While he's drawn it freehand on the letter, I'm convinced that underneath he's got a drawing board that he's done a draft, whether it's in pen or pencil. He's worked it all out and then he's just gone through and copied over the top, so it's neat. But you can see all these parallel lines and the way that they're crossing over, the way that you've got this 45-degree angle, which is it's not perfect, but it's almost there, and all the 90-degree turns. This is not something that I think he's just done straight off the cuff. He's prepared for this in a way that allows him to showcase what's happening with his concept, but it also reveals that he's got experience in drafting. And as I've mentioned before, due to the sections and these cute little cartoony vehicles in the section, he understands road grading and he's drawn these vehicles in exactly like a landscape architect would do. You can also see how the parts of the watch line up to the center line, following through to the center line of what is the hand of a clock, and that swinging round with this curved arc, which we went through in the last video. The arrow is copied from technical drawing textbook. And when you lay out the whole page like this in landscape format, I've kind of gone ahead here and just added in some things to make it more like a master plan. But you can actually see if you added in a line here where he's got his sheet numbers, almost like a drawing number. He's got his drawing title, bus goes bang, car passes by okay. It's revision A because he did a second bus bomb diagram drawing, and I've just joked and called it the Zodiac Bus Bomb Blast Project. When we get to revision B, you could call this plan the second bus bomb diagram that was sent through in 1970. He's refined the drafting to be much simpler, but you can still see how it's laid out very neatly within these two, I guess, kind of guidelines. He's just drawn in all the text as well. Likely he's drawn the plans first and then added the lettering. And you can see it's neatly compartmentalized, not quite as good as the revision A, the first bus bomb diagram where the section and plan are projected correctly. Here he's squeezed the section over to the side with the plan here. But there is this connection through here with the sun off the page almost, or off the drawing frame, going through to the sensors that he's put in here. I also find it really interesting that in this second diagram, he's not using as much formal drafting techniques as he was in the previous diagram, where he had dimension callouts. He had more professional arrows with the 1:3 ratio and filled in. Here with the arrows, he's got them open. It's actually a second preference arrow. He's less formal. However, he has utilized a textbook section and he's added in the cars. And the reason why I think this is highly probable that there's a landscape architect behind these drawings is, one, because these sections come from landscape architecture textbooks. Some of the principles of this road grading design are found in civil engineering books as well. But the inclusion of the cars onto a section that doesn't have cars naturally, he's put these cars onto a landscape architecture grading section from a university grade, I guess, work module, and then he's added cars in there. So there's two things, and I sort of, would debate whether an engineer would add that in. Why would they be trying to allude to it being a different type of designer? I think it's much more likely that it's someone who has these skills and they're utilizing those skills knows that they can probably get away with it, that it's not something that's incriminating like a fingerprint. But for me, when I look at this, it's quite obvious the way it's been laid out has some purpose and it's quite systematic. When we look at the second bus bomb diagram, we can also see that there is some parallel and vertical lines that are very consistent. It does appear that he has used some guidelines underneath, not as much as the first bus bomb diagram. He may not have used a drawing board for this, but there are some guidelines that he's done underneath to keep some of these lines consistent and to lay out what he's doing and then perhaps copies over. We can see that particularly here with the A and the B boxes that fill neatly into these parallel lines with the arrows coming through, and just the general layout of the page with super neat and confident freehand lines. Now, when we have a look at the actual bomb, now I'm not a bomb expert and nor am I an electrical engineer, but have started doing a bit of digging around this and just interrogating whether this could actually work or not. So a lot of people are familiar with this sketch here or diagram, which comes from Kurt Saxon's Poor Man's James Bond. Now, this book is a compilation of different articles and I guess contraptions that you could make. It wasn't printed until 1972, which means that if Zodiac had access to this drawing, he's probably found it from earlier underground pamphlets that Kirk Saxon was involved with in the 1960s. He had some adverts in the Berkeley Barb, but that was in the 70s. I haven't been able to find some of the pamphlets, but clearly they were produced earlier than 1972. And you can see that he's taken on some of the ideas of this wristwatch time bomb, with the hand here forming around to create a connection, powered by a 6-volt car battery, and then with a photoelectric sensor, he calls it, and a torch. Now, also the diagram holistically kind of comes across similar to some diagrams I found in 60s hobbyist electronic magazines from the 60s. So this could be information that he's winged onto the rest of his diagrams from publications like Kirk Saxon's and hobbyist level electronic ideas. It's really interesting that he talks about using a torch and a photoelectric sensor. Now, in 1969, there were a number of different photoelectric sensors. He doesn't really specify which one it is or how it could be working, and we'll get into that a bit later. But this idea of a torch shining across to a mirror and then coming back into a sensor that triggers a bomb actually kind of seems ridiculous the more I look into it. It's also really interesting the way he's looking at this connection here. It doesn't seem to have any backup with electronics circuits that I've looked at. It almost looks like the top of a 9-volt battery that you can see in here, and he's used that as the switch rather than actually using a formal drafting with switching. Yet he does use some other techniques of formal drafting of electronics, which you can see here in the open circuits. So the other thing is with this idea of a timer that I'm kind of curious about. In his letters, he spoke about the clock having a battery to last a year. Now, for one, if you're going to bury a bomb into a hillside or somewhere and leave it until next fall, that's a hell of a long time for a torch and a cardboard tube that's painted black on the inside and batteries and things to get wet. There's no talk about waterproofing. There's really not much talk about the reality of how this would happen. Yet he calls it a masterpiece. But if you're going to have a clock that goes for a year, how is this timer going to work? So he doesn't need it to last a year. He only needs the hand to go 11 hours and 59 seconds around to switch it on. And if you look at this diagram, in the side elevation, you can see that the hand is quite small, points to about 230. And then over here, where it's shown diagrammatically at a fairly precise 45-degree angle, again, probably done by a drawing board underneath, 7:30, and then where it activates the bomb supposedly and it forms the closed circuit connection is 9 o'clock. That's about 6.5 hours. That's just what he's shown. It could be diagrammatic. But either way, as that, if he's got his connections here on a watch face, and that clock hand goes round and forms the connection, he's really only got 3/4 of 12 hours. He's only got a relatively short time, which could work. He goes in the middle of the night, connects up the timer, and then in the morning it's ready to go for when the bus goes by. So I'm just curious why he mentioned that the clock has to have power for a year. It doesn't really need much power, and probably to complete the circuit he doesn't even need a 6-volt car battery. So it's kind of cartoony and a bit conceptual and a bit crazy, if you ask me. He calls it a masterpiece, but it's like something out of the cartoons with the classic clock attached to a bomb like you'd see in movies or comic characters. Calling it a masterpiece, I think, is a bit rich when you look at what he's actually drawn and how much information he's just not showing and whether it could actually really work or not. You compare that to the Harvey's Resort bombing in Lake Tahoe in 1980 or 1981. Now, this is just a comparison. They went to huge complexity, the people who made this destructive device. It had 28 switches on the top panel. It had sticks of dynamite or TNT in the top panel, so when they tried to blow this top panel off, the bomb exploded, and thankfully the resort casino had been evacuated. Some of these switches were dummy switches, some of them were to release the tilt function so it could be moved around without detonating. Now, that's a complex bomb that was real. I'm not going to say any bomb's a masterpiece, but for Zodiac to call this drawing here a masterpiece, I'm dubious. Now, he has got a little bit of technical drawing information. I scoured hundreds of old electrical engineering books and hobbyist books. I did find a few similar things. He does the correct non-connection for the wires, and it's done in a rather unique way with these little triangle things, because normally triangles are diodes in electrical plans, and this is usually a connection point, but he's made these slightly larger so they're not a connected line. But essentially it just means that the wires don't touch and they cross over each other, and you can see that working as the circuit goes round and underneath and then connects through, and this one's going over and connecting through to each of the 5 bags of bombs that he talks about. So I did find some interesting stuff from particularly Fowler's Electrical Engineering Pocket Book, where you can see those connections. He's done that quite correctly. And then the only thing I could find really similar to these little triangle spacings is from electrical and electronics drawing, and also from this electrical drafting and design textbooks, which were from the 60s, possibly other editions published earlier. But here we can see something similar in arrangement, but there are several areas of the bus bump diagrams that Zodiac's doing that are not correct in terms of the switching, and then other areas he's followed some influence, whether from this diagram or for another diagram, doesn't really matter. So he's made some attempt to kind of look like he knows what he's talking about. I'm skeptical. You can also see from these connections here on the battery, it gets a little bit gnarly as he's trying to draw it all in, but if you zoom right in, he does get all the different positive, negative points, similar to what you'd see here with connections and old electronic textbooks or electronics guides. He doesn't necessarily have to have done a degree in electrical engineering. This kind of circuit design is relatively simple. He's not building a Marshall amplifier from scratch. And also just kind of interesting, some of these electrical symbols as well in these charts, which I talked a lot about before. Some of the symbols used in the ciphers can also be referenced back to a lot of plans and design schedules. So again, let's come back to this idea that he's going to do a torch and have an electronic photo sensor that, as the bus goes by, is going to blow up the kiddies. Now, again, in that first bus bomb diagram, he didn't actually show an embankment. He just had a tube floating in midair. But perhaps one of the influences that kind of gave him this idea could be something even as simple as the detector ray, which was out in the 40s and in fact was even in toy catalogs, so you could buy this as a kid. There's not as many photoelectric sensors as there are now. Not all of them are cheap. Like now we can get really cheap sensors, made in China. Back in the day, they're a little bit more expensive. And I know that certain photo sensors were used to count cars on highways. Now, possibly that's where he got this idea from. They're also used for streetlights, sprinkler systems, other things. But actually there are far better modern methods that we use now. But I'd be quite interested to know if he'd seen this in some, toy catalogue when he was younger, or he knows about this through amateur publications. But I'm skeptical that you have a mirror and a torch from 1969 going across a road to a mirror, going back into a cardboard tube that's painted to trigger some contraption like this that then blows up the bus, and assuming that he's got to put all the work in to house this stuff wherever it is, an embankment or whatever he's trying to show on the first bus bump diagram. You're dealing with rain, animals. What if this gets shifted by someone walking along or a maintenance gardener coming along? How is he hiding all this stuff? It's actually kind of ridiculous, even though some people say, yes, the bomb could work, it's legit. Maybe the materials in the actual fertilizer and the bombs, the bag of bombs, but there's really a lot of information missing that I think he's sort of bluffing and is really just coming up with this concept idea. Whether he'd actually go ahead with this, I think, is really debatable. I found this interesting diagram in an old landscape architecture textbook, which has the old sun again, like the second bus bomb diagram. It's just talking about acoustic walls or glare walls reflecting off onto the road environment, but just kind of interesting that there's quite a lot of landscape architecture diagrams that deal with the sun and acoustics relative to road design, and possibly he was influenced by that as well. But certainly I think there's ample opportunities for Zodiac to see stuff like this that isn't high level, isn't military. It's quite crude in its idea. I think it's how he puts it all together and the context of the timing after the murders that he's doing these diagrams. And I have a theory around that as well, which is if the Zodiac Killer is from Vallejo and there was heat on Vallejo, certainly after the first two murders, but also after Lake Berryessa, Police were interviewing certain people, fingers were being pointed. I think he tried to do a different murder in Presidio Heights to take heat off Vallejo and push it onto San Francisco Police Department and that region. He broadens his murders to the city, and then the context of doing the bombs really starts taking the focus away from being a murderer to terrorism and something larger, which confuses police. It sends them chasing around all sorts of things. I just find it amazing that the police really, at least as far as I know, didn't look at these diagrams. I would have called his bluff and said, you need to provide us more information like they did with earlier letters. I'm sure the Zodiac would be happy to draw more. Perhaps it's a way of getting him to draw more and reveal more about him. And the fact that so much attention is on the materials and ingredients in the bomb, like fertilizer and gravel and stove oil, and not actually on the systematic approach to how he's done these drawings or what influences he could be utilizing. Now, we went through in the last video that the Zodiac has this understanding of raised, crowned and road sections. I just wanted to provide a few more examples showing this, and I think one of the important things with this is a lot of these high level diagrams actually got some vertical exaggeration to show them more clearly, and that's exactly what the Zodiac has drawn here, and particularly the way that he emphasizes the crowned road with the two vehicles skewing away from each other, really similar to this diagram. This is a modern diagram, but wherever possible I do try to find old textbook diagrams that are from the 60s. Here's one of a bus, and again, while it's difficult to pinpoint an exact section that he might have copied off, or he may even just freehanded this, you can see that there's a lot of diagrams that are similar that relate to landscape architecture and civil engineering to a degree. This one's even got a little bus ready to go. And as we mentioned before, the second bus bomb diagram includes this section, and it's copied directly from Grade Easy 1967, and I found it in a number of other areas. Interestingly, Grade Easy 1967 and another book that I showed the original overlay on have it sloping this way. A lot of the other more modern versions that I've found are going the other way. Either way, the dimensions are exact. It's not a flat site. It's not a long, wide road with a medium. It's not a country one-way lane. To me, it seems likely that he's copied it off something like Grade Easy, which was around in 1967. Although in the preface of Grade Easy, the author does say that he'd taken a lot of the diagrams from previous work, so I suspect a diagram like this may turn up in an old road engineering book from even earlier, in the 40s, 30s, 50s, and these sort of things get copied again. Also, like this little drawing that I found, just the way the little A, B and C, obviously that's something that's really common, but just the way he labels it is consistent with drafting and a design profession. Now, I also want to focus again on the cars, because in my profession as a landscape architect, urban planner, there's really only one profession that draws cars in that particular way. Modern civil engineers will sometimes use cars in road sections because of AutoCAD. They can just copy and paste in a car or vehicle block. But because landscape architecture is a lot more graphic in its approach, and it's also really looking at the look and feel rather than black and white engineering, chainage and bulk earthworks and levels and grades, it's primarily landscape architects that draw these sort of vehicles into sections. And also, it's quite common for landscape architects to block in the tyres, just like Zodiac's done. And you can see the artist here has missed these tyres. Not always, but it's fairly common that they'll block in the tyres. These are fairly detailed cars, not like Zodiac. Zodiac's are a little bit more looser and quicker. He's He'd be mad to actually show off his true drawing talent, because I think someone would recognize it. But more broadly, I certainly recognize his sections as landscape architecture sections. And I'll just go through a couple more just to show cute little cars drawn in sections. There's a section of plan view projected, and quite often you see the larger vehicle and a car together. Larger vehicle and car, larger vehicle and car to show scale. Again, I think the only thing that's missing from Zodiac sections is trees and people to complete the picture. In the first bus bomb diagram, as we went through before, he extrapolates the road and section neatly. They're in scale. And we can see some examples here, again, of landscape architects doing streetscape sections with the plan and section extrapolated one to each other. And again, we can see the bus and small vehicle, large vehicle and small vehicle coming in, just like Zodiac's done down here. So I find that quite remarkable that, one, he has an understanding of basic road design. He's done sections very similar to how a landscape architect would do, or he's copied directly from a landscape architecture grading textbook, and then by completing it with the cars, he's indicating experience of that or knowledge of that, or there's some kind of interaction with landscape architecture. Here you can see a construction level drawing, and again, all of these drawings I'm trying to get from the late 60s or early 70s, and also I'm trying to get drawings wherever I can from the San Francisco Bay Area or North Bay Area. This is from Santa Rosa. This is a construction drawing that shows a section, again the car, general grading, but you can see that it's a lot more graphic, being landscape architecture, to show the look and the feel, as well as some complex construction drawings. It's very different to civil engineering, which is not really looking at the look and feel or requiring cute cars and buses, but it's to show chainage, grading levels, and other black and white details. You can also see that quite often the civil engineers will use graph paper behind, which is interesting. And there's even graph paper that's designed for vertical exaggeration, which is quite often used on roads, particularly where there's not much grade in the road. They will use vertically exaggerated sections so that it's more clear what the grade is doing. All right, now I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the line work on the bus bomb diagram. Firstly are these sort of contour-like, kind of parallel lines going around. They're fairly loose and informal. They're just showing cables going from the battery or wires as part of the circuit. And it's kind of interesting because I mentioned they look like contours, because they really do look like contours, just in the way there's a bit of parallel and following them. They're not too separately behaving wires that are naturally calling in their ways. And I just thought that was quite interesting. It could be nothing, but it just shows that having experience in drawing contours from landscape grading plans, one would just naturally tend to follow the same curves as one draws. And again, they're not getting too close. There's reasonable distance and gaps between each line. The other is this little wiggly line here. Now, it's fairly common for a lot of artists to use an informal line like that, and it is part of formal drafting in terms of like a broken line where you have a long section that's shortened, or just for informal ground or line work. But I have known a lot of landscape architects and architects that draw exactly like this, kind of like you can see in this diagram here, where the hatching is very wobbly and loose in this informal butter paper sketch. And as you can see here as a representation. So I just thought that's an interesting pickup that, you know, if he was a full electrical engineer, he'd probably draw these as straighter connections, and of course with a proper switch connection rather than these two 9-volt battery teeth looking things, and 4 connection points going to what must be the copper coils he talked about. But really, that's a pretty silly way of creating a switch. You could combine all of those in a different circuit to a single point that connects the circuit. But anyway, he's drawing this sort of diagrammatically, but I think there's actually a bit of evidence in this line work of being consistent with contours and being consistent with sketch line work that is very common in architecture and landscape architecture. Alright, it's time for design. Now, I mentioned a number of influences in my first video around cultural influences and hinted at the graphic and artistic visualization of landscape architecture. Now, unlike engineering, which is much more precise and black and white, it's really does it work or does it not work, landscape architecture involves the look and the feel, visualizing or using a visual and spatial language to get across particularly concept ideas, and also just in the craft of doing models, plans, or communications for clients or stakeholders or for the community. Landscape architects quite often do plans or illustrations that are designed for the general public rather than precise engineering specifications. And I just wanted to sort of go through a number of elements to this. So first of all, in the 60s, you've got this incredible upheaval, a counterculture. There's incredible different civil movements. There's really a huge amount of innovation in design that we can see in literature, in art, in music, in films. And of course, design was no different. Now, we can see with some of these urban design or planning magazines from the 60s, we've got elements of collage, upside down writing here as well, graphics, images, things stuck together to create a message. We also have a lot of art and landscape architecture in pure design terms. For example, Burle Marx, the famous Brazilian landscape architect, was heavily influenced by Cubist paintings, and his plans were almost like artworks with different colors and forms. Really amazing stuff. And then there's just the actual artistic talent of pulling together pen and ink sketches. Now, in an old Cal Poly Pomona catalogue or journal, I found this quite interesting on landscape architecture, that as part of the Polyview exhibition, the landscape architects united art and utility. And you can see from here, creative music, espresso, coffee, and colour. These were the elements of vivid expression and release of frustration commixed for one of the Landscape Architecture Design Forum's first organised activities, a paint party. Lo and behold, a painting party. At the party, students contributed their individual talent to a mural representing the group's total expression of feeling. Sounds similar to Zodiac. He was quite adept at expressing his feelings. A cardinal endeavour of the forum during the winter quarter was the landscape architecture art sale. Students' work in sculpture, watercolour, oil, pencil and ink were offered for sale. Other art pieces displayed were mobiles, collages and enamel jewellery. So we can see, even just from this article, which is from the late 60s, probably around 66 or 67, that at least in Cal Poly Pomona, they were even having art exhibitions and art sales and experimenting with different mediums, which was obviously great as part of the design forum, but also it's part of the professional vocabulary. We can see in modern landscape architecture plans like these two in the top left, everything's done on computers now, so it's Photoshop, AutoCAD, 3D programs like Rhino and Revit to create these incredible modern collages, which is primarily done on Adobe InDesign. But back in the day, it was all done by hand, either collages and cutouts to form a message or create that visual language, or hand drawing with pencils, pen and ink, your drafting equipment, and circle templates, etc. And here you can see this is a photo from the Polyview art sale or exhibition from Cal Poly, late 60s, where the students are preparing their presentation. Now, I mentioned in a podcast that I did with the excellent Ned DeHaan that one of the reasons why I got into landscape architecture was because I was into comics and cartoons when I was younger, and I could draw well. I was never really good enough to be a fine artist, and probably not specific enough to ever be a cartoon artist. But you can see here, this is from Cal Poly, much later, probably somewhere in the 2000s, where a student advertising a similar sort of forum has done a terrific cartoon that looks professional. So having these drawing skills, these artistic skills that come through in Zodiac's communications, the bus bomb diagram, the cards, having drawing skills are incredibly handy. And you can see evidence of that in some of Zodiac's communications, things like the hatching on the fletching of an arrow, the confidence of his line work, the way that he is not just writing, but he's using this multimedia approach, collage. He's writing descriptive sentences and words, copying bits from the Mikado and other sources, drawing these diagrams essentially with the goal of trying to scare the public or taunt the police. But you can see that landscape architecture pulls together all those things. You need this artistic ability to be able to draw plans and visualization. There's also the communication of different ideas. And we can even see here from the Cal Poly Pomona course catalogues some of that collage and pen and ink sketches, even with trees used for the 67-68 catalogue. These two sketches here actually come from a history of landscape design textbook that was available in the 60s as well. And again, for the visual narrative, they're using cartoon strips to showcase the history of landscape design and civilization, as well as some esoteric elements such as the axis mundi, the north, south, east, west, and then the vertical plane between the sky and the underworld. Perhaps the Zodiac also got some influence from this esoteric background to landscape architecture, that it's not all so black and white in engineering. There are social and historical elements that come into landscape architecture. There's also the geometry of form and function, and how plans and designs are developed out of geometry to become landscape plans. And then, of course, there's the reference that Zodiac used in his Pines letter, where he's taken a really excellent pen and ink sketch, which looks like it has some marker pens or watercolor washes through it. While a lot of people have looked at, perhaps it points to where there's a body somewhere in this picture, a much more simple explanation is Zodiac is someone who likes pen and ink sketches, likes this one in particular. It's superb development. It's a landscape open space, and he's taken that and used that for a particular reason. Also in the Forest Pine card, I haven't got it up, the Zodiac version, it talks about the Sierra Club. And of course the Sierra Club was an environmental group, heavily into stewardship of the land and sustainability, which is exactly what landscape architects nurture. Now, We'll take a bit of a deep dive into the 13 card because I think it's actually quite interesting. I did pick up on this in my last video where I talked about all the labeling and how neatly the labeling had been done in parallel. Now, I'm not sure if he used some guidelines to prepare this letter. It looks like it's two bits of photocopied elements that have had various drafts to come together. When you're working in a profession where you're sticking on labels all the time, you don't really need guidelines. You just get a sixth sense for following parallel and making sure everything's neat. So we can see this layout here, that there are certain things that line up really well, the typesetting and the parallel lines that, he's cut this out all pretty neatly, and you can see some of the newspaper clippings and how he's cut them out. He's cut them out fairly close to the edges of the words, and they're all lined up very easily, and it's also organized fairly well on the page, similar to the bus bomb diagrams. This use of the different text being upside down is also really similar to a lot of elements we see in late 60s collage work, as evidenced by this urban design journal. And we can see here again with landscape architecture the stick-on schedules and typical details that you don't have to redraw each time. And of course they all line up and are very neat. So while anyone could do this sort of thing, it's fairly basic crafts. There is still a lot of, not so much effort, but there's a focus on keeping it neat. And I suspect that the Zodiac Killer has experience in doing this, and he certainly must enjoy it. Otherwise, why would he go to all this trouble? He's already shown his handwriting. He could just write all this out. So he's doing this for fun, but he's also got an interest in design and using collage. This contrasts with the fake, similar fake collage that came in. That's not an authenticated Zodiac letter. And you can see that it's horribly messy. It doesn't have the pizzazz or the creativity or the same skills as Zodiac has. On the back of the card, there's the San Francisco Chronicle and SF, which is in negative. Now recently some bit of chatter on Tom Voigt's site was talking about whether San Francisco Chronicle actually printed in negative like this. I've got a far easier explanation for how he did this. He would have cut out the Chronicle and letters, arranged it how he wanted to, and then stuck that down onto a piece of paper and photocopied it in negative. And my estimation is that he's then reused some of the black photocopied paper to create the Zodiac crosshairs. Now, landscape architects and designers also use Letraset for lettering and for certain textures and articulation of what's happening. For example, in this plan here, you can't quite see it, but this black line through here is actually Letraset, and it just is rubbed on, and sometimes they peel off a little bit, and that's just to show a stormwater channel on the side of the road. And again, you can see some of the symbols here. Beautiful graphics, old hand-drawn plan. It's drawn in pen and ink on trace over the top of another trace plan that's then been combined to print, which is the civil engineering drawings underneath. And excellent symbols for planting. And we can see Letraset used here. This is an EDOR plan of Santa Rosa. I used to work for EDOR, their headquarters in San Francisco, very famous firm. Now been bought out by ACOM, but these letters are not stuck on. They've all been done by Letraset. And if you zoom into this, some of them peel off. I don't think that's what's happening here with this cross though, because Letraset, when it peels off, particularly on a car that's probably been manhandled by police and whoever else, would peel off either completely or wouldn't show this overlap so well. I don't think this is a peeling off. I think that's the edge of paper that's come out of a printer. And I'll tell you why. One, he's already done it here, so he's had access to a photocopier, which could be in an office, design studio, or university campus late at night. He's printed it off in inverse, cut out this part to stick back onto the card, and then he's used some of the remainder of that black photocopy to cut out the circle and the bands. And you can see on this lower resolution how they're overlapping, so there's a depth as each has been cut out and pasted on. Now, with old photocopiers, the carbon is not as good as modern photocopiers, and so what can happen is the carbon can rub off, particularly if you're cutting this out with a knife or scissors on a cutting board, however he's doing it. Some of the carbon may have rubbed off, and that would explain really logically, I think, why there's red felt tip pen at the base of this cross here in particular, that as the carbon's rubbed off, he's used a red felt tip pen to re-etch in that cross. Whereas if it was letraset, it'd be much harder to draw over the top. With a felt tip pen, it wouldn't be seen. There's no carbon on the letraset. It's a thinner kind of film that is burnished on. But here, this to me would be a logical solution of how he's done this card. And of course, in the previous other side of the card where there's all of the clippings that are pasted on, he's then photocopied that before sending it off, so there's no fingerprints where he's stuck the labels on or DNA and glue. We can see this similar artistic approach in the Halloween card, where again I think there was some photocopying involved with parts of the card, but either way he's spent a bit of time having a lot of fun with this card. He's got the geometric patterns, which is actually similar to some labeling on plans that you see that are usually revision notes or a note from someone who's reviewed the plans. Sometimes go diagonally, like not in contract, similar to non-negotiable on a check. And that's kind of fitting in with this geometry that we have up here. And of course there was, no ciphers on the inside. But look, the main point with this is there's an arrangement of lettering in a graphic design format, both handwritten and also stuck on labels. He's stuck on the pumpkin down here, and then he's used a paint or a whiteout pen to go over and create that contrasting 14 and some of the other elements, which you can see are not quite as bright and vibrant as some of the others. So really quite fascinating how the Zodiac has these abilities. And again, none of this is something that's going to go into an art museum, but collectively when you look at the drawings, the writings, the crime scene locations and these cards, it's someone who has experience and enjoyment obviously in preparing this visual media, this design media. Here's just some more examples of old documentation from the late 60s, early 70s, again from North Bay area. You can see how neat this schedule is, how neat the handwriting is, and all the symbology for this is a planting schedule. And what's interesting, this hasn't been done with graph paper, it's actually just been done with the backing of pencil line work. I mentioned in the last video that it's likely that the Zodiac Killer used graph paper to prepare the ciphers, which is probably the most logical answer. However, he could have also used a backing sheet that had his own line work, particularly if he wanted to achieve the certain amount of cells and rows, or columns and cells and rows, for the cipher preparation to fit onto something like Monarch letter paper. He could have prepared that as a base using his own grid and done it to the dimensions that he wanted. And here's some more examples of some more complex landscape architecture drawings, again with cut out lettering. All these little labels here are all cut out and stuck on. Very neat, and shows some construction drawings that's probably closer to the engineering side of landscape architecture. And again, these cutout labels used, and it's a bit hard to zoom in on here, but there are lots of pencil line work here in setting up the writing and that organization. And of course, this is formal professional drafting by Edel, Ekbo Dean Austin Williams. Now, looking at the Halloween card, which was sent to Paul Avery on October 27th, 1970, it's really interesting to have a look at how Zodiac has demonstrated his arts and craft, but also drafting experience in these cards. Now, a lot of people have talked about these cards, so I'm not going to go into detail with anagrams or which company made the cards. The main point is very similar to the 13 card. He has used a photocopier and copied part of the card and then stuck it back onto the original. The color original is over here on the left, and then the photocopy is pasted on to both sides, and that probably allows him to paint better on the purchase. He doesn't leave any fingerprints, less chance of that happening, and he can stick on the skeleton and do the photocopy, and the same on the front where he uses a pumpkin. And it demonstrates that he's used some artistic skill in putting this all together. The stuck on eyes looking like clockwork orange, the lettering boo and 14, more eyes with lashes that are drawn back on, and he's used a brush and some white paint, or he's used a whiteout pen. And then we can see also his little symbology down in the right hand corner, looking very neat, almost like it's his logo. And if we take a bit of a deep dive into the whole package that he sent through, we'll start to see some interesting geometry. Now, when we look at the envelope that it came through, and we have this sorry no cipher, if we align up our protractor, we can see that this is generally 30 degrees, almost exactly, and sorry no cipher this way is 60 degrees, which is quite interesting. Now, as David Aranchek has noted, he may have been suggesting clues for the 340 cipher, but what I'm interested in is his use of 30 and 60 degree and 45 degree set squares or triangular rulers, the most common drafting rulers you'd find. And it's quite interesting how he's utilized this not just in his drafting of the bus bum diagrams, which are very neat and had this backing draft or guidelines to prepare. It looks like he's doing something similar here, or he's so used to drawing in 30 and 60 and 45 degrees that he can do that with authority. Now, the same thing with the Paradise Slaves, by gun, by fire, by rope, by knife. You can see a couple of interesting things. The parallels vertically and horizontally are very well organized. He's also got an interesting thing happening with this side angle of the words. He hasn't tried to fit the words down in the same way as he has with Paradise. Actually, at almost at an 8-degree angle. And we can see also with this angular writing, similar to the no cipher text, Merry Xmas New Year. On this letter is at 30 degrees. And on Rush to Editor, on this letter, it's almost 30 degrees. It's about 25 degrees. Looks like he's just free-handed those in. Merry Christmas. It also looks like it's about 25 degrees, but they're generally around the 30-degree mark. Interestingly, it's quite common to use these types of lettering in landscape documentation, for example here, where it's an extra note that's been added on to show an elimination. It's like a reviewing note from someone else other than the drafter, or void, not in contract, similar to non-negotiable. 30 degrees, 45 degrees here, and there's actually some guidelines on this plan in pencil that note that out, so it's possible that's what Zodiac has done on these cards or letters as well. And of course you can see some background pencil marks here in creating the guidelines, and in doing leader arrow call outs for details, they're often at similar angles, 60, 30, 45. So I think this is really interesting to look at the geometry that he's using in this communications. This is the original card before he's photocopied the new photocopied artwork of his on top of this section, while keeping the left hand side, and then of course he's photocopied this section over here. Now when we look at the logo, it's almost similar to the boss bum diagram as a kind of logo or title block down the bottom. You can see he's got these neat parallel lines running through. Now he may not have done guidelines for this, he's just has the talent and natural practice to be able to do a neatly parallel line, but it wouldn't be impossible for him to put a photocopied, even a black photocopy over a light table, over some guidelines to make sure that he keeps the cattle brand Diablo logo, the VF logo, the Z logo, and the Zodiac logo. And incredible that in the holistic view of Zodiac Killer, he's moving from just signing off saying I am the Zodiac or Z. He's now got multiple brands as part of his identity, which is quite phenomenal. And then when we look at this branding, we can also see the same geometry coming through. So we have the 90-degree angle here and the 45-degree for the V. We then also have the dots lined up in the 30-60, which is classic geometry, symbolism that you may have seen elsewhere. And then even the way that this tail is moving off from the main 45-degree, that's at 30 degrees. I think this one's just slightly off, and this one almost looks like it's 45-degree, but certainly this one over here is 30 degrees. So some really interesting geometry happening with this card, some interesting arts and craft, but I'm particularly interested in how in a lot of this documentation there's evidence of using a drawing board, using a light table, using the 30, 60 and 45-degree triangular rulers. All right, now I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole with handwriting. I did talk briefly in my last video that there are some similarities between some of the processes and writing and elements of Zodiac that align with or are consistent with landscape architectural writing. So I'm just going to go through this briefly, but a couple of things. It's kind of interesting when you look at a number of elements such as the plus symbol instead of an and. Quite a lot of people will say, well, I've got a suspect and he does a plus or he does the same kind of and I think there's not much to that. There's a lot of different people use a shortened version of and like this, but it is really common in landscape architecture. And also this idea of the language, the compliance language, words like shall, comes up a lot in different documentation, which I'll go through. Again, you can just see the labeling on things like legends, the neat arrangement, and some aspects that we see in Zodiac. Over to the right here, this text I found from a very old plan, and what I found interesting was the F's and the double L's are really tight and narrow, similar to how Zodiac does his tight, narrow double L's, and not suggesting this landscape architecture team, it's a husband and wife team, Zodiac, but they were in the North Bay area, working around San Rafael, Santa Rosa, Vallejo, and Fairfield from the 50s to the 60s. I sometimes wonder what the influences of Zodiac are and whether he had seen plans by this team and may have even copied the way they do their double L's and F's. Could be a good way of disguising. I don't know. That's just speculation, but I just found this particular handwriting quite interesting. It's also all in lowercase as well, and has the little plus or a modification of the plus symbol for ands. And again, all through here, you can start to see how neat this lettering is, which would be ideal for working with ciphers. And there's some interesting things. Spray, in quite a lot of irrigation legends, the word spray is used quite a lot, the different spray of nozzles. Again, may not be anything in that. In this particular one, they're using the small lowercase and rather than a symbol. Zodiac's got a pretty consistent angle to his writing, but there's not much in that again because there's a lot of people write from cursive writing backgrounds in that slope, but you can see it's a similar slope to what we have in a lot of landscape writing. Still don't know about this soy bottle symbol, but I thought it'd be interesting just to put the protractor over and see that it's generally following 60 degrees or 30 degrees. Here's some more examples of that plus and we can see that in a few areas in here. Sometimes it's plus, sometimes it's the mini and like you'd see on a keyboard, and sometimes it's like a backwards E, sometimes it's a simple plus like this one. I can't even see, but there'll be something in there. Here's another plus, and I can't see here too, but there's something in there that alludes to all of that. And you'll see a lot of shorthand in documentation. Quite often the @ symbol, like you see in emails, is used. Therefore, the 3 dots, W with a slash, which means width. And then I just chucked in this image because it shows a nice landscape plan drawn straight onto graph paper. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about university campuses and landscape architecture. In my last video, I went through a number of reasons why I believe there's evidence to suggest that the Zodiac Killer was a student. Maybe not a young student, more likely to be a mature age student, given most of the descriptions of him were from late 20s all the way up to 45. It's more likely he was around 30 when you look at all the descriptions, and also when you look at his communications, because his communications have a maturity that's above high school, obviously, or someone who's completely uneducated and in a trade profession. At the same time, it doesn't show the maturity of someone who's been in the workforce for a long time or dealing with the responsibilities of family and high-level work in that regard. Now, I'm going to look at two campuses and a number of elements around that. The other thing about the whole student thing is just the way that Zodiac talked about buttons and pigs. Yet I don't really think he was a hippie. He didn't come across in the actions of his crimes. They were very quick crimes that happened in literally several minutes. The longest, Lake Berryessa, it happened all within a year. So there's quite a bit of precision in terms of that outputs, but then a lot of time writing the letters. And in the letters, there's a lot of sayings and language that harks back to really someone who grew up as a kid in the 50s and earlier. And I don't really get the impression he's a young counterculture hippie smoking dope. You ain't going to get away with crimes like this. The reference to buttons and pigs was used a lot in a lot of the underground press. It kind of harks almost like he's showing off to the press, trying to scare the general public, taunt the police, but he wants to be known around campus. He wants to be known by students by having their buttons. He wants to be on the front page of the newspaper as this person who's a little bit anti-establishment, but yet at the same time I don't get that Vietnam vet counterculture vibe from his communications. Now, the other reason why I'm going to pick Cal Poly Pomona and UC Berkeley is because I have a connection with both those campuses, both Cal Poly Pomona and also Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. One is because when I was going through university, we had some guests, colleagues and staff come across from Cal Poly, including the great Gary Dwyer, who is a fabulous landscape architect from the late 60s, early 70s, and was head of the faculty. And then also from exchange students that came to my university from various places in America and Canada. And then I've worked with EDOR and other companies overseas that are based out of San Francisco, all ex-UC Berkeley. And through those connections and visitation, I do know a little bit about Cal Poly Pomona and UC Berkeley landscape architecture courses. Now, I've also got hold of some older photographs, and this photograph here with a beautiful Sierra mountains in the background and a nice map of Cal Poly from the late 60s from their course catalogue. Really fantastic campus. And what's interesting about the landscape architecture course there was relatively new in a way. It started in 1957, and as a campus, the landscape architecture studios were part of the School of Agriculture, but there's also a lot of new buildings with sort of funky design studio areas where people could draw, have access to various drawing boards, light tables, photocopiers, etc. And you can see a young landscape architect student with the circle template going. And this is actually Cal Poly San Luis Obispo up here, but all the other photographs are Cal Poly Pomona, bravely curious. Now, if we have a look at some of the courses and subjects that are part of landscape architecture, we can see a fair bit of alignment with what I've been talking about today, but also with the Zodiac Killer on a few elements. Now, there's general introductions to landscape drafting and theory of design and fundamentals of drawings, which we've sort of gone through. Then there's the life sciences and some introduction to mathematics, also physical education, which is kind of cool. I don't think that's really offered as a subject at uni anymore. And then it sort of starts getting into design and There's also some interesting subjects like survey, fundamentals and application. This is one of the subjects where potentially a landscape architect would learn about radians and also site planning in relation to survey, which relates very cleanly with the Phillips Zodiac map, where he had a code and stated that the map would help people locate his bomb, so to speak, which I doubt that it was actually ever dug in. Someone would have found it by now. There's land planning, there's philosophy, there's management and general psychology, soils and this sort of thing. There's history and literature of landscape architecture, American civilization, and then of course there's the elements of urban design. Again, there's quite a lot of social aspects, land use and transportation, urban redevelopment, and state and local government, which is where he could start potentially picking up language like the people of San Francisco have not complied. I shall go on a killing rampage. I shall do this. I shall do that. There's also forensics, but don't get your hopes up. It's not police forensics. Now, if we compare that with electronic engineering and mechanical engineering, we can see that it's vastly different in the sense that there's some similar drafting and introduction courses, but then it really goes more into heavy-duty chemistry and metallurgy and electronics, much more on mathematics and physics, and that sort of heavy-duty thermodynamics that you need for these kinds of disciplines. In mechanical engineering, the same sort of thing. There's more on metalwork and the processes behind kinetics and kinematics and lots of things to do with workshop and tooling and industry, really. There's not as much creative aspects as what we see in landscape. It's much more creative in landscape architecture, and in these engineering professions it's much more mathematical and scientific and less to do with environment. And that's exactly why the landscape architecture course is in the School of Agriculture, and of course engineering is its own building in engineering. Now here's some photographs from the late 60s, Cal Poly Pomona. You can see some of the students over here doing their survey work, possibly even dealing with radians and working out set out, measurement, location, land and site planning, really. You'll also note, similar to the police officer Fawkes at Presidio Heights, they're all wearing these tan engineering boots, which are really just site boots, things you can take on to site and not worry about getting dirty. This is Stuart French, who's a famous landscape architect and ended up running the program of landscape architecture at Cal Poly over here, and having a bit of wine out down at the beach. And it would have been a great course actually in the late 60s, 70s. Beautiful environments, lots of field trips out to Noble Creek. This is down in Laguna Beach. They had field excursions to San Diego and work experience in San Diego. They also had excursions to Santa Barbara and up the coast to St. Louis Obispo, which has a close connection. There's a strong affiliation, particularly with landscape architecture, between St. Louis Obispo and Cal Poly Pomona. And it's a very hands-on course where you need to have all these skills that we've been going through in this course. This guy's got his tan engineering boots on again, obviously doing the survey, coming out of an old Portaloo, and this guy's maybe that's Zodiac reading Playboy. Who knows? Maybe Zodiac's one of the people in this picture, or someone who went to one of these courses. We'll never know, but there's some interesting facts that we're going through in this course that support the skills and locations of where Zodiac. And landscape architecture, the tools of the trade in those days is all hand drawing with pencils to start with, pen and ink, very simple stuff. And one of the things that I find interesting is the studio life of a landscape architect. You can see here's some studio pics here and here from the late 50s and early 60s, and here from the late 60s, early 70s. This is Cal Poly, of course. What's really interesting is you'll notice that a lot of the landscape architects back in the day would use these metal fishing boxes to store all the materials, such as felt tip pens, erasers, circle templates, and the like. And it's kind of interesting in a way because they make great storage areas, but when you look at the layout, this could quite easily fit Zodiac's felt tip pens, some of his brushes and other pens, and a hole punch, scissors or knife for cutting out things, possibly even enough room to fit in Monarch paper or some of his communications like cards and photocopies. Who knows? We do know of certain people in the case. There's the famous grey box. What was the grey box that Arthur Lee Allen had and hid his codes in? Well, we'll never know. But what kind of grey box was it? Now, Arthur Lee Allen was into fishing, just like his brother, Ron Allen, who was a landscape architect and also went to Cal Poly Pomona, along with Don Chaney and Sandy Panzarella. Now, I wonder if the grey box that's mentioned, if it exists, but let's say it does, wouldn't it be interesting if it was someone like this and carried Zodiac's drafting supplies? So, just speculating, but I reckon that's a pretty good guess of Zodiac. Probably had a toolbox, a tackle box for doing his bidding. Here's some photos of University California, Berkeley. I just want to emphasize again, carrying on from my last video, that I talked about Berkeley and its positioning in the late 60s in terms of civil rights, the war in Vietnam, counterculture. In terms of landscape architecture, University of California, Berkeley is really the epicenter of modern landscape design. It's where most of the great landscape architects of what we think about as the modern vernacular of mid-century landscape architecture comes from people who went to University of California, Berkeley, and taught there and mentored there. People like Dan Kiley, Garrett Ekbo, Lawrence Halpern, and just a terrific campus that really spearheaded so much of what we know as modern landscape architecture. And again, what's so interesting about Berkeley is, and why I think Zodiac was a student, because underground press like the Berkeley Barb are always talking about pigs. There's this whole focus on freedom and give us the park and People's Park, almost like what the Zodiac was talking about in his must print in the paper letter. I disappeared into the park. I was walking down the block towards the park. That's Julius Kahn Park. There's a lot of things that sort of come together around Berkeley and San Francisco in the 60s. And I just find it really interesting that the Zodiac's talking about buttons and wanting his own button. He wants a Zodiac button in here, with all these peace and flower power and black power and anti-Vietnam buttons. And, you know, like, does the Zodiac really have a hatred for the police, or is he kind of tapping into this, I guess, attitude that people had in the late 60s around police? And I don't know. If you're working and you're beyond being a student, you got other things to think about rather than the underground press. I get the impression he's a student or someone who recently graduated and might be a little bit older, but his target audience is the citizens of San Francisco. But if he's asking for people to wear buttons and is talking about blue pigs and blue meanies and those references, but really not much other hippie stuff, everything else he kind of talks about seems to hark back to more around the 50s and early 60s. That's the impression I get, at least, from his drawing style and the vocational training that comes from books like Technical Drawing. The type of language he uses, I think it all adds up to someone who is a student and quite likely could be someone who is at Cal Poly Pomona or UC Berkeley. So to conclude this video, I just wanted to show that the drawings that the Zodiac Killer prepared in his communications to law enforcement and the media, they just remind me of landscape architects and urban designers, because they often use simplified and abstracted drawings to convey ideas and concepts, just like the Zodiac Killer is doing, focusing on the relationship between spaces, circulation and urban elements, which the Zodiac does. He also talks about social relationships, and it's a very visual language that the Zodiac uses, both in his writing and of course in his drawings. The use of cartoon-like drawings in the Zodiac Killer's diagrams may have been a deliberate choice to convey a sense of simplicity and clarity, making the diagrams more accessible, understandable, maybe to a wider audience, that fame, that attention that he was looking for. And I just wanted to see if I could shine a light on these diagrams through this presentation. And speaking of light, it's quite interesting that as I was going through and researching a lot of old landscape architecture textbooks, I kept on coming across in very high level diagrams suns. Now, of course, anyone can draw a sun. It's kind of what we do as kids. But it's just interesting that in so many diagrams you have the sun, particularly in these sort of, I guess, guideline style graphic elements. So the Zodiac's diagrams, sent in a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969, depict a plan view of a bus and a bomb attached, along with a cross-section showing the bomb's placement and detonation. Not always that clear. That floating tube hadn't really got to doing the embankment yet. But the diagrams are detailed and they're technical, and they use symbols and notation to convey the layout and mechanics of the bomb. Now, looking through all these old textbooks, some used in landscape architecture, electronic engineering, civil engineering, similarly represent this organization of space and structures and use symbols, for notation and information or scale, relationships between elements, and clarity in style and notation between the Zodiac Killer's diagrams. And he may have had training or experience in a field like landscape architecture. And it's a profession that uses felt tip pens, circle templates. You have a good understanding of many different disciplines, from highly technical to highly conceptual or environmental. And as I've explained in my first video, The use of circular arrows in technical drawing is a common convention to use rotation, but having that fletching on the arrow is identical to a technical drawing textbook that is used commonly for general drafting, and would be definitely something that drafters would be aware of in the 60s. And I think that information just adds another piece of the puzzle to Zodiac Killer's background and skills, and as I said before, suggests he had training in technical drawing, drafting, and that related field. And I feel that landscape architecture is really an ideal for that, because of that drawing skill with pen and ink, the combination of collage, text, puzzles, that interpretation element that he drew or tried to draw people in with. And it's amazing that he did, because again, the late 60s, the good times, there's so much happening. He had so much competition. It's amazing that he did get the attention that he did. But who knows? It'll all be a mystery, a secret. But again, I hope this shines some light onto the Zodiac case. See you next time.